Well, good morning. I'm David Daw. I'm the Tree Nut Entomology Advisor at Merced County. I think many of you know we've been working with Marsh on this project for 9 years.
I think so.
I know. It's been a while. So it's good
been
to
a
see
while.
many familiar faces. It's great to see you all again. I'm going to cover a wide variety of topics, starting with pest management, nutrition, diseases, pruning, horticulture, on and on and on and on it goes. I'm covering a little bit for May. May wasn't able to make it. Kulumber, the Fresno County Advisory Group, she wasn't able to make it this morning, as we had a grinding field day in the north part of Stanislaus County. So she went up there since she's heavily involved with that project due to an award that she received from the state to continue the work in that. So she sends her apologies, and she thought I'd be a suitable stand-in. So that's a compliment, I suppose.
Yeah, David, I'm sorry. Who was that?
May Kulumber.
Oh, right. Okay, May. Yeah.
So to starting off, pest management, since Chris is here, he can correct me when I'm wrong, but as we go into the dormant period, one thing I think a lot of people forget, at least in the past 10 years for me, is dormant spur sampling. It's something that takes a lot of time to go out and clip spurs from an orchard, but it's very critical to get an understanding of San Jose scale infestation, as well as other types of issues that may be there. Brown almond mite, walnut scale if you're planting Independence or Monterey, as well as, of course, San Jose. So based on the percentage of infestation that you find on your spurs, it'll give you an idea if you need to treat with oil in dormant time or moving in with the oil and a growth regulator. Usually they're looking at C's or Centaur if they're doing type of a treatment with the chemical. So basically, you just walk around randomly through your orchard like we always do, right? We have all this time in the dormancy. And clipping spurs, and then bring those in and look underneath them, using a dissecting scope for infestation. There's a lot of great information on the IPM website. This may be something that you may want to direct either your consultant or your PCA to help you with, but it's something that should be considered. I bring up walnut scale. It's exactly what it looks like in walnut. It's a daisy-shaped white scale, and it tends to be very severe in Monterey and Independence. We don't know why it has such a specificity with those two varieties, but I've been in orchards with Monterey that are just coated with it. Walnut scale. So it's a lot larger than San Jose. You can see it with your naked eye versus San Jose. I still need a magnifying scope to actually really see it consistently. Usually you can kind of scrape San Jose, you can scrape back the lichen and see if there's any little wax caps underneath it. But with walnut scale, it's pretty obvious when you have an infestation. So keep an eye out. It's something we've been seeing. Again, oil with insecticide. I think it's around 30% infestation rate is kind of that trigger point between the two. But Chris might, is that right? 30% infestation between when you treat? Something like that?
Yeah.
Check the IPM guidelines.
Yeah, check. Yeah. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it sounds about right.
I'm not an entomologist, so I'm just acting like one. Don't tell this to all the people at Cafe yesterday when I gave a talk on entomology. Aren't you glad you weren't there for that? So, there's privileges of leaving. Just make stuff up all the time. So speaking of making stuff up, no, it's kidding. Now moving on to bloom. One thing is if you're concerned about PTB or peach twig borer, we used to go through and use a product called Dimilin at bloom, and it did a really nice job of controlling peach twig borer. So then recently we found that there's some issues with this product moving back into the hives, and it did seem that some collapse of hives was associated with the use of Dimilin, and they found the product actually in the hive at concentrations that were deemed to be potentially lethal to the bee brood, so the baby bees that are being born. So that led to about 4 to 5 years ago a relatively large effort to try to remove that as a recommendation of putting Dimilin in with the tank-ride material going out at flower. And so many of us are saying, well, we can include that if we do a delayed dormant spray. But in many cases, we don't do a delayed dormant spray unless we have scale, as I mentioned before. So if you are doing a scale spray, include it. The oil will wick it into the hibernaculum, which is the overwintering part of the limb or of the moth pest, and it will kill it. But another alternative is to actually use BT at bloom. So back in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of work looking at BT, which is a biological product. Essentially, it's derived from a bacillus species. And essentially, it's a crystal that does a nice job of cutting up larvae of the moth pests, so in this case, peachtree borer. And it's a relatively safe product. It's actually used in organic systems. Doesn't mean safe, but it's relatively safe, benign to humans, benign to bees. And BT, it's also known as sold as dipel. And it can be, you need to make 2 applications with this if you're planning to use it. It looks to be somewhere, if you look at the data, you want 2 applications, 2 weeks apart, somewhere around full bloom and petal fall for making those sprays. So those are the appropriate times if you're looking for BT for peachtree borer. What's that? Full bloom and petal fall. Most people don't treat for peachtree borer, but it's just an option if you're feeling you have an issue or if your processing damage is coming back. There is some data that suggests that peachtree borer can damage the nut, which attracts the orange worms, so they tend to work a little bit in tandem. More of an issue up north, but again, just to throw it out there, some thought process. It's kind of been brushed over because of the ease of controlling with other pests, especially with mace.
Back in the mid-80s, we used to use a lot of it on apricots and bloom. When you didn't have a whole lot of pressure, you only needed 1 application.
Yeah, and it's a people have been actually relying a little bit more on BT because of the re-entry interval and the post-harvest interval is very short. So there's people who tend to spray a lot of BT as they're coming into harvest to try to manage this big flare-up in navel orange worm. But it has its weaknesses. It's just not very persistent in the environment, and that's why you need to make the 2 applications. You can make an application of Dimilin that lasts 3 to 4 weeks. You make an application of BT, it's going to last maybe a week, unless if there's rain. So just throw that out there for some thought process. So on to disease management. We've got a lot to cover, not really, but diseases, scab. Anybody had issues with scab? Great, don't need to cover it. If you did, or if you're worried about scab, if you're growing Carmel, or if you've seen scab and lesions on your wood, it's important to consider maybe a copper and oil treatment during dormant, or just make sure you're on time with your sprays. Scab is a springtime disease. It really proliferates between 2 and 5 weeks post-petal fall. So making sure we get a spray in that time period is really good. The reason why I asked, because during the dormant we had some recent work that's shown to be very effective in controlling scab by burning out the lesions on the green wood, and that include either a copper and oil application or a chlorothalonil oil, which is also known as Bravo or Echo. But Bravo weather stick mixed with oil applied in the dormant does a nice job of burning out lesions. The problem with putting on Bravo is it's very stage dependent. If you see any green pushing out the tips of the buds, of the swollen buds, do not make the application. That combination is highly phytotoxic if you have green tissue on the tree. So and that's one reason why a lot of people get nervous at applying Bravo in season, even though it's a great broad spectrum fungicide, is we tend to use oil around the same time we're using Bravo. And if there's residual oil on the tree and we make an application of Bravo on that leaf, we will get a little bit of burn. It's a great fungicide. I think it's a 1-2 punch on scab. It really does a job of knocking it down. And personally and anecdotally, it seems like orchards that use chlorothalonil for a scab spray, either at petal fall or post-petal fall, before that pre-harvest period, seem to not have a lot of scab issues. So if you are battling scab, even if you can't get it out at dormant, consider putting it in that petal fall period. What about rust? You guys are just knocking these diseases out, all right. So a couple of years ago I wrote an article about how we can use zinc sulfate to defoliate trees. And this essentially gets the leaves onto the ground and allows them to begin the process of degradation while we have warmer temperatures. And this usually is an application we make in mid to late October. And after a couple weeks after application, the leaves will turn yellow and begin to drop. The rates seem to always kind of keep increasing. When we first started making this, it was about 20 to 30 pounds. And then you all learned how to farm trees more vigorously, and it became 30 to 40 pounds. And still you're farming more vigorously, so it's becoming between 30 and 50 pounds. Once you start looking at the price point on that, I kind of grow a little bit weary about spraying 50 pounds of zinc sulfate per acre. You know, a lot of people still do. And it does help with defoliation if you're looking to prune on young trees and things like that. But I also provide, when you balance out the economics of just putting in another spray in that May, June, essentially that late April, early May period next year. So oftentimes we have issues with rust. It's because we're not treating in that late springtime period. We do a great job. My experience is we do a great job controlling bloom diseases, probably overspray at bloom, and we spray at petal fall, and then we get kind of, well, we already sprayed 2 times this year, the budget's getting tight, we'll wait till it rains, and maybe I'll put one in March, and then that's maybe it till full split. And rust really comes in that 5 weeks post petal fall and later. So you're looking at sprays of late April, early May, incorporating something in there. And although we don't necessarily recommend this blanket approach, but there was a saying when I first started, it's called my AAA May spray. Abound for rust, ivermectin, and a sauna, your pyrethroid and your miticide to manage it. So, but that abound is what I'm referring to with that aspect. That putting that fungicide in that beginning part of May will really help reduce rust if you're struggling with it. But if it's a severe infestation and they're young trees and you want to get the leaves down, yeah, you can probably hit it with some zinc, Jim, and that might help you a little bit going into next year. Because rust only overwinters on leaf tissue. So that's where it's surviving from year to year. And so the longer those leaves stay on the tree, the longer it takes for them to break down once they fall to the ground because everything begins to
Is there a
cool off.
point when it's too early in the fall to put it on?
I think if you're making that application too close to the post-harvest, I say you're probably right around now, mid-October is when you're looking to make the application. It's going to take 2 weeks for it to come into effect. I think there's times where it's too late. And going into mid to late November and trying to zinc the trees at that point, I don't think it's doing much good. The idea is to get that leaf on the ground when the soil surface is warm to help begin the process of breaking it down. And so, now till probably the end of October, you're probably all right, but once you get into November, it's probably getting too cold. So moving to, and that would be the same if you're going to be zinking pistachios too, for the pistachio farmers here as well. So let's move to pruning, and then we'll go into nutrition. So I know what the data says. We shouldn't prune our trees, and the more we prune our trees, the more we reduce yield. And so generally we want to make sure if we do decide to prune our trees, there's reasons to prune our orchards. And I say that because I get in a lot of orchards that probably need to be pruned. And everyone says, well, you tell us not to prune. I said, well, yes, but no. So the farmer buys are shuffled, but there's reasons to prune orchards, and there's a good time to do orchards. So let's talk with mature orchards. So when you look at the data, when you mature orchards, and this is based on studies that were done in Kern County, Stanislaus County, as well as up at Nichols, pruning mature orchards really doesn't have, a mild pruning of orchard does not really impact your yield. So we're talking about maturity. But pruning does improve a lot of different aspects of a mature orchard. It helps remove vertical wood that may be from too hard of pruning cuts earlier in the life. That helps get you better spray deposition. It helps you with machine access and worker safety. And these are all different types of cuts. So limbing trees up, so you get your equipment underneath, as well as maybe cutting out some vertical shoots that are really going straight up through the center and not really providing much fruiting wood, probably can be done. The difference is you can limb up your trees as much as you want and you won't get a lot of regrowth. If you cut too many of those vertical shoots out of the tree will respond to the light that's falling onto it and re-push that growth. So this is a process that has to be done relatively slowly when you try to restructure these trees. So I'm just putting that out there, and I would always say contact us if you have any questions. Now,
I have a question about that. So have you had any growers talking about, I alluded to this a little bit, that they were saying that because of the heavier canopies, that there's more humidity, and I think that it was hull rot was kind of pointing the finger at that says they're kind of sticking the mummies on the tree a little bit harder, and the shaking doesn't get it off, and so thus more pulling expense.
There's a lot of aspects of canopy management that do go into nut removal, and it's not just hull rot, which is, I guess you could say there is some influence of humidity, but it's also when you get those vertical shoots that go straight to the center of the tree, and I'm sure we've all seen some of these, especially in highly vigorous orchards that will prune too hard. So we'll get to young tree pruning when we talk about prune too hard. They go straight up through the center of the tree, and they look like, when you shake it goes like this. And it doesn't matter how hard you shake the trunk of the tree, maybe it'll go a little bit more like that. And so those types of limbs just they're not going to remove, they're not going to have a good nut removal, just period. And so that's a little bit of why I want to get it out. And that is that, Chris, that you now have this vertical wood. And so when you try to push the spray through the canopy, you're now hitting that wood with the spray, and you're not getting good deposition in the upper part of the canopy, which is where we tend to have a lot of navel worm issues. So some pruning is good, just don't go overboard. If you make a lot of cuts, you'll just reform all that vertical wood right back to the center of the tree. So it's a slow cut. Generally, if you're battling these real tall orchards with a lot of straight vertical wood, and I think most of you know what I mean, I recommend somewhere around 1 to 2 cuts per tree per year at the most. And you slowly bring these trees back into shape. So, and by doing that, you're allowing the canopy to fill that light back in the next growing season to prevent it from shooting that wood right back up. I know it's expensive. I'm just putting it out there if it's something you're battling. Yes, sir.
You wouldn't recommend mechanical pruning, not toppers and edgers?
You've read my mind. I'm just getting there. So I saw that coming down the road, I-5, coming north. Someone was taking the hedgers to their field. So what do I think of hedging? It's the horticulturalist's nightmare. So that the hedging companies will not like hearing this, but there are reasons to hedge, but I think we need to think about what we're trying to do. Often we're hedging because we're compensating for a poor planting decision, a poor planting and planting decision, to where we planted vigorous trees on the ground and they grew too big. And so they essentially overlapped, and now we're trying to open the canopy up so we can get some light on the ground, assist with drying as well as venting out the canopy. It's probably the only thing we can really do to do that at the point that we're now have the orchards where they are, once they're overgrown. But one thing I would consider is, why don't we move them out a little further? That extra space in that row going to 23 feet or 24 feet instead of 22 in these vigorous conditions can reduce that hedging. Because once we start hedging, we're cutting off fruiting area. And we're cutting off the perimeter of the canopy, which is capturing the most light. And we also make a lot of stub cuts. And so these stub cuts just kind of sit there, and I think they can be relatively dangerous. But if they do regrow, they grow like this. So now we're back to this vertical wood issue. Now, is it the end of the world if we hedge? Absolutely not. And in many cases, it's the easiest way and the cheapest way to probably get through an orchard and do the canopy management practices we need. But I would say the next year you probably want to follow up with a little bit of selective pruning to kind of thin out the dead wood that's forming from that. So I'd probably balance it out that way. Is it may be necessary to kind of get that much canopy out of there to get you a 2-foot strip of light on the ground, and then go back through and try to work within the operational budget to maybe go back through and do a little bit of hand thinning the next year if possible. I had a good conversation with a farmer about this. He says, it's so cheap to hedge, why don't I just keep hedging? And he's right, you can, but eventually you'll get the wall of death, I call it, where all the wood goes straight up, and it just dies right here, and it still shades out everything underneath. And so what we worked on is, he hedges a quarter of his field, he goes every other row, and then he'll come back through and on a rotation pattern, and then he dedicates the rest of his canopy management budget to work on the block he hedged the previous year. So he's trying to keep it within the operational budget of the expectations of his managers, the owners, And so he's concentrating and trying to rotate around the field once every 4 years, where everything essentially gets hedged, as well as a little bit of hand thinning on a once in every 4 year basis. That's how he figured it out. Operationally, I think you'll be able to figure it out there. Now, hedging has some value, and I think there's a difference between dormant hedging as well as springtime hedging. And they're providing different types of cuts. So first off, we're creating a heading cut. And so as when we limb up, and the heading cut is very simple, is we cut the head off the limb. And we'll back up one step further. When we prune, we do either one of two cuts. One's a heading cut, the other is a thinning cut, where we take it off at a particular joint. So when we limb up trees, we tend to thin back to the scaffold. And when we make these thinning cuts, it's more of a natural process for the tree where it doesn't necessarily want to push growth. When we make a heading cut, what we do is we cut off the control center of the tree. And the tree responds thinking it's been injured and wanting to recapture all this light that it thinks it's lost. Remember, it doesn't care that we're pruning it. It's responding to it as an injury, just like it has for the last five probably million of years. And it thinks something fell in the canopy, lights opened up, and so now it's going to try to grow for that light. And that's why you hit that vertical good for growth. And yeah, we can call it some fancy terms like it's epicormic growth and it grows without regulation and blah, blah, blah. But really, it's you cut off the head, it cuts off the control center, the limb takes off. You have long internodal growth, long space between your buds, and it grows rapidly to try to chase the light. Once it establishes itself and gets the light, then it sends off the vertical wood. Well, that takes about 2 to 3 years. So that's why it's something I would caution against, especially on young, vigorous growing trees. Going through and doing dormant heading on, let's say, a 2 or 3 year old orchard, in order to lower the canopy because you're afraid of wind, you'll end up with taller trees the next year and growth that you don't like. So what's the alternative? Well, what if we move that hedging to the spring? So in this case, you wait for the tree to push a little bit of growth, usually around 8 to 12 inches, and you cut back and you just tip it. And so in that case, that will slow the growth down. And the way to think of it is a dormant heading cut will invigorate a shoot. An in-season heading cut will slow the growth of the shoot. So by doing that, it causes the tree to kind of reset for a couple days before it develops the bud and push out from that. So you'll get that same crow's nest from both those types of cuts. The difference is how fast that growth will occur due to the action of that cut. Does that make sense?
So you're saying with a hedger, or you're saying with a pruning shear?
It doesn't matter. It's all the same. But what I'm seeing with most young orchard canopy management, we do a good job of doing some tree structuring or not. That's a preference the first year. And then after the second and third year, a lot of people are just bringing in hedgers in the dormant season and cutting the tops off the trees. And you can do it this year. It's the same way. It just takes more time. And they're doing that because they think it reduces wind throw and it reduces growth, keeps the tree shorter, and it actually doesn't do any of that. It makes the tree taller at the end of the second year because instead of putting growth this way in lateral limbs, it's putting growth this way because this control center is lost on the top of the limb. So either by shear or by hedger on young trees, I think if you want shorter trees because of some type of condition to protect wind breaks and you don't want to tie, you need to do in-season heading to do that. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I'm just saying dormant season hedging is wrong. That's what I will say. I've seen enough of these orchards to feel pretty confident in thinking that it creates more problems than it helps. I don't know what your thoughts, what you see, Ernie, but I see a lot of hedge orchards.
Just up in Patterson, in the windy areas, a lot of times in the springtime, you start having some, and I've never gone in and hedged, but we've hedged with a pruning shear.
Yeah, and in-season pruning is fine. Remember, we can prune these trees anytime we want. We typically do it in the dormant because we like the leaves off the trees and we can see what we're doing. I always say you can see how ugly it is once the clothes are off.
Question.
Yeah.
Before you leave pruning, What do you suggest on alders where everything wants to go vertical?
Yeah, so that's not just alders, but you'll see Padre, Fritz, any of these upright varieties. It's similar. I would probably recommend more of an in-season pass. And same thing with Monterey, believe it or not. I saw some interesting orchards in Australia where, and that wind twisting that you get, because they don't want to tie their trees, their labor is about $28 an hour. And so they don't want to go through and tie their trees. So what they do is on that spring of the second year, they wait to get about this much growth. This is about early April, and they go through and they make a hedging pass. So they essentially cut that growth to kind of stall it out, the tree out for a little bit, as well as on top. So hedge and top to slow it down. And that's when I think I would target the alders. I've seen some interesting things with developing alders in the first year to help reduce that steep angle. That also helps prevent the wind cracks. But we want to prevent that epicormic growth, that rapid, uncontrolled growth that tends to occur from a dormant cut. So I would argue let's move away from the dormant headings on alders and try to put it in season. And when they make that cut in Australia, they actually go down to wood that's about the size of your pointer finger. They cut into 1-year-old wood. So they're not just cutting off the new growth, they're coming down to the height they want and hitting it. And it does seem to slow that tree down quite a bit.
But does it still want to grow this way, or does it grow this way?
So in Monterey, what they do is by doing it, they prevent that wind twisting from occurring, so it doesn't flop as much. It still flops, this is Monterey, but it doesn't flop as much because they're stiffening up those winds. Something to consider. I'd probably try it on a small basis. But again, the difference is dormant versus in season. You do that as a dormant cut going into December and January, you're going to invigorate those shoots come spring, and you're going to end up with a worse problem. So I'm just trying to make sure we understand that there's a difference between dormant cuts and then the springtime heading cut on these trees. Clear as mud? I can tell by everybody's not going, looking. All right, great.
So is pruning okay? Is pruning okay this spring?
Yeah, so that gets me to the point is pruning is okay, period. Except for when we prune, we have to know what we're doing and how much we're cutting off. So if we prune, whenever we prune, we're cutting off cropping potential. And this is especially true with young trees that don't have a lot of canopy. So we prune for a purpose. And the purpose isn't to increase crop. No, that's not. We know we're not going to increase crop with pruning. There's enough studies out there to show that we're not. Mature orchards, we may maintain crop depending on the type of pruning, but if it's a heavy cut, we're going to reduce it. If it's a hedging pass, we're going to reduce it. If it's young trees, we're going to reduce it. We're going to reduce the cropping potential in the third, fourth, and fifth year. No doubt about it. But if we're trying to manage the canopy from the aspect of trying to target an effect, so we don't want to tie the trees and we're growing in vigorous conditions, we could use some in-season methods to slow that down so we don't have to tie as much or as high. Or we could do some more thinning cuts to try to open that canopy to get more ventilation through it as well as spray deposition. So that's more what I'm kind of thinking is prune with a purpose. Don't just prune because it's now getting into October, November, December, it's time to prune. Now the timing of pruning, with mature trees it doesn't matter. We've done studies, it's probably been 20 years ago now, where they compare pruning in the fall versus the winter versus the spring, and on mature trees it doesn't matter. The only difference is it's what you see. People don't like pruning in the spring because they see the crop they cut off. And then once they see the crop they cut off, they don't want to prune anymore. Like, well, I got too much crop on the ground, I don't want to do it. But it'd been no different, they would have pruned in the fall. They still cut the same amount of crop off. So pruning now is probably in the fall is a good time for mature orchards because it's a little bit slower. Harvest is kind of rolling up. You're doing some maintenance. You want to get the brush shredded. You want to get it incorporated before you have to flail mold those mummies that Chris is telling you need to shake onto the ground. Young trees, you can start now too, even first leaf trees. The start timing on first leaf is when it starts to cool down enough where you won't get a push of that new growth. So as long as you're performing these scaffold cuts essentially anywhere from about late October through about the last week of March, you'll see no impact on growth. So you're kind of looking for when the tree's really slowing down in the fall, all the way to full leaf expansion in spring. Now, what would influence the timing on young tree pruning is actually rain. And so when we're making these cuts on the trunk, so doing our scaffold selection in first leaf trees, or even making cuts on that primary scaffold in second leaf trees, we generally want to avoid the rain as best as we can. I know it's not always predictable, but try, if you look into the forecast and there's a multi-day rain event, maybe delay pruning as much as you can. So why do we do that? We've been seeing an increase of these different wood canker fungi that are coming into these pruning wounds. You could use paint with Topsom M. It does have a label, and that will protect these wounds from being infected, but it's another process that has to occur. Some people are using heavy stickers with Topsom M, turning off the top of their sprayers and just going through that way. That could also be done. But generally, we probably want to look at some type of control if we're pruning through the orchard and we come into a major rainstorm. All right. Any other questions?
One question on whole rot.
Yep.
We're not getting whole rot in third leaf. Is there anything that can be done other than water management?
Well, I think the issue with whole rot is more nutrition management than water management. This has been a little bit, now this is of course based on observations as well as what we know from our nutrition rate studies. But I've worked a lot with water management through hull split, and it seems like the only way you're going to not get a hull rot through water management is just severely stress the trees. And at that point, you're impacting your kernel weights, and you also lead to a lot of stick tights in your other varieties. So water management has a role, but I don't think it's the only way of doing it. I think we have to take a little bit of a multifaceted approach, and that's looking at our leaf tissue. And often what we tend to see in third and fourth leaf trees is we tend to over-fertilize these trees to develop them. And we also tend to plant them in this area on very rich ground, usually tomato ground that we apply a lot of nitrogen to. There's a lot of residual nitrogen in the soil. So we come into the third leaf, and we've been fertilizing these trees heavily to get them growing, and we have a lot of off-site nitrogen. So what I mean by that is if you just look at a drip system, when you put that bare root or potted tree into it, we're irrigating and fertilizing that area in between the trees that it doesn't have roots into. And as those roots continue to move outward, they have access to all that residual nitrate that's going into that ground. So that third leaf tree is getting a lot of extra nitrogen. And I think that's why we tend to see a lot more hull rot on third leaf trees. They just have a lot more nitrogen in the system. They're really juiced up. They're ready to go. And so is that hull, and that's what that fungus wants. Probably heard me say this multiple times before. Hull rot's like putting a fat kid in a candy store. That opens up. It's a sterile environment. It's full of proteins, full of sugar, and it's a moist environment. And fungi just go to town. It's no different if you took a loaf of bread, put a little bit of water on it, put it in a nice warm position, without, of course, fungicides in it. No one knows we're putting bread, but that's another story. So, taking that loaf of homemade bread and put it out on the countertop with water, with a wet paper towel in the bag, it'll grow mold within a day. So, it gives you an idea. These spores are everywhere. It's about how conducive that environment is. And then you add density of the canopy and all these other aspects to it that really reduce the drawdown. So how to manage it? Based on what we've done studies on first and second leaf trees, we need about 30 to 40 pounds. It's actually about 3 to 4 ounces of nitrogen per tree. And of course, you have a higher density that's going to change for both those years. But the issue is you have these inefficiencies of application that we tend to see a little bit greater yield response or growth response by putting out more nitrogen. So that means that as our root system is expanding, so let's back up. Let's say we determined that we need to put out 40 pounds in our first leaf tree, but we know half of it's not going to get into the root zone because of the drip system. So we put out 60 to 65. So that means somewhere in that system we have an extra 20 pounds of nitrogen. And as long as it's still in, based on our soil reports, the next year we have to realize that we have an extra 10 pounds that tree has access to. So going maybe up to 65 pounds isn't needed. You can probably lower that rate, believe it or not, in the second leaf in comparison to the first leaf, because that's a bigger root system and it's moving outward. Then we get into the third year, we can probably lower it again, but we have to take into account the crop load on the tree too. So now that 30 to 40 pounds, 3 to 4 ounces per tree is there, plus the estimated crop load of 85 pounds of nitrogen for every 1,000 we're expected off an acre. So that's why young trees are tricky. So you're feeding the beast to get it to grow, and then you got to feed the crop once the crop starts coming on these third and fourth leaf trees. Second leaf if you're growing independence. So keep in mind of that residual N that's going out there, and try to account for that inefficiency that we have. And this could be something as pulling a soil test for nitrogen, just in that middle row, see how many parts per million are there. And it's tricky, I know, but it's something we have to keep in mind. And take into account what was on that ground before. If it's a lot of tomato ground, you may not even need to apply any nitrogen the first year. You're sitting around 20, 25, 30 ppm nitrate in the soil. Not saying I see a lot of that, but I have seen some of it. Does that help? Kind of? Not now?
David, have you seen much nitrogen out there?
Yeah, this year, so that's a really good point. So we did pick up a new whole rot pathogen 2 years ago. I wouldn't say it's overly new. We have seen it before, but it's an Aspergillus species. So we always talk about monolinea, rhizopus. Rhizopus is Solonifer is the one we commonly think of as the red mold, and now recently it's Aspergillus niger. And we picked it up in Kern County with the farm advisor down there, Mohammed Yeglar. And Mohammed's done some really good work and found out why it's been more of an issue the past year. So I'll get to that in a minute. But the difference between Aspergillus niger and rhizopus, one, if you know what you're looking for on the hull, you can pick it up. I'm not even going to try to explain that. It's even challenging for me. But rhizopus will actually run. It produces a toxin in the hull that then moves into the limb and can run anywhere from 18 to 24 inches and kill that entire shoot. Aspergillus niger does produce a toxin, but it doesn't run as far, and it tends just to kill that spur. So it will kill the nut, or it'll essentially grow on the nut, and it'll kill that spur that nut is attached to. And it doesn't move 18 inches up the limb. It's maybe moving an inch or two into that spur and killing it. So the way I can tell the difference between the two is by looking how many spurs are kind of dead, but the wood is still green. And you don't get that black streaking through the center of the wood. That's how I look at it between the two. If I was just going from the field, just kind of the placement and how frequent the strikes are, and if you're getting a kill going back up the limb. Now, why are we seeing it? It's heat related. So Mohammed did this, Dr. Yeglar did this great work where he essentially grew these plates at different temperatures, average temperatures, and he found the hotter it gets, Aspergillus niger will grow more rapidly, and the rate of growth of rhizopus slows down. So the past 2 Julys, right at Halswood, we have had hot summers, really hot summers, all the way from Sacramento down to Bakersfield. And so that hot temperature that we experienced both day and nighttime, the diurnal flux wasn't very great, favored the growth of Aspergillus over rhizopus. And that's why we've had more issues with it the past couple of years. So if we come into a cool summer next year, probably won't see much of it. If it's another hot summer in July, we'll probably see more of it. And so it's really linked to those temperatures. And I think we'll see more of that I think at the upcoming Rome conference. So it's interesting how it's linked to that.
Well, a lot of guys have switched, when it comes to also they switch from a micro sprinkler to a drip line. That seems to help keep the humidity down.
That's
your
correct.
experience.
Yep, that's correct. So anything you can do to prevent evaporation, that's a little bit why. Okay, I'm going to roundabout answer that question. That's a little bit why we recommend deficit irrigation during hull split. It's to essentially slow down the transpiration of the tree. So as we begin to stress that tree, it slows down the transpiration, and that does reduce canopy humidity. And also and that the tree will pull moisture from wherever it can as it begins to stress, including from the hull, because that's still connected there, believe it or not. Remember, nut weight still accumulates through the end of July, almost into harvest. So severe stress to that period is not good, but a mild stress is tolerable, and there's reasons to do it. So it pulls a little bit of moisture out, makes it a little bit less conducive for infection. Now, humidity in the canopy does something similar. So I don't know how you experience the Midwest, but if you put a wet shirt out on a line in the Midwest, it's going to take all day to dry. You do it here, it dries within an hour. And that's due to 30% ambient humidity in California and 80% ambient humidity in the Midwest. And so it's the same thing. Having more humidity in that canopy takes longer to dry the nut down and has a longer period of susceptibility. More conducive conditions for effects. So yeah, anything that increases and sprays more water through evaporation or transpiration into the canopy can increase hull rot. That includes not just micro sprinklers, but also poor water infiltration. The stickiest orchards I walk in are the ones that don't get the water to go into the ground. It just sits there and sits on top and evaporates. So you have the tree pumping up water, wicking up water, and you have the evaporation coming off the soil surface. So I would say first work on infiltration rates, and then look at maybe ways of reducing canopy humidity through irrigation systems. Okay, so on the nutrition. Good discussion on hull rot, guys. Appreciate that. Post-harvest, nitrogen, not much is needed at this point of the season anyways. Remember, 12% of our demand from mid-August to the end of the year. So that roughly kind of is cookbook to about 50 pounds of nitrogen in the post-harvest. But more recently, you're starting to see recommendations come out about trimming that post-harvest nitrogen application depending upon timing. So if we Boulder Mountain Grow off the 15th of August and we were putting out nitrogen at that point, sure, we could probably get in somewhere around 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen once you account for inefficiencies into the tree. But if we wait till mid-September, we're probably not going to get that much in. Probably going to be closer to 20 to 25 pounds by that time. And the later we get, the less we can get to the tree. So based on that, Franz Niederhauser's done some good work showing that you actually don't need post-harvest fertilization if you have high leaf nitrogen. So look at your midsummer leaf tissue values, and if you're in the 2.6, 2.7 range, you probably don't need to put out more than 10 pounds. If you're over 2.8, I wouldn't put any out. That helps you bleed off some of that nitrogen to help you with your hull rot problem the following years. So it's hard to believe that this recommendation of putting out post-harvest nitrogen, we're telling you not to do it, but it's really dependent upon that midsummer tissue and timing of application. Going out now and putting out 30 pounds, you're throwing your money away. It's not going to make it into the tree. Although it'll stay in the soil until it's leached out, the problem is, you know how California winters are. We never know what's going to happen. And it could be leached out by the time we go in season.
David, does soil tests tell you anything this time of year?
It'll tell you how much nitrate's there. I mean, you're just not going to get a lot of uptake. So yeah, that's a good point. And I was going to get to that in a minute about soil tests. Because the soil test for nitrate will tell you if you need to apply more, as well as what I commonly see people doing is more as phosphorus applications. And so looking at how much phosphorus, usually we're using Olsen in California, but looking at how much phosphorus is present, and if we're over 15 parts per million, you probably don't need to apply any phosphorus either. So, you know, it's that soil test does have value. And, you know, you can go down to 3 feet if you want, but top 12, top 18 inches for a quick test is good. If you're managing salinity, we're going to go down to 5 feet. You can use the data out of that to get what you want. But a quick nutrition test will give you some value. So let's go on to phosphorus, because I hear a lot of people putting on phosphorus. Must be some great salesman down here. He's not in the room or something happening. We don't use a lot of phosphorus in almonds. Somewhere around 12 to 15 units, so P2O5, 12 to 15 pounds of P2O5, 12 to 15 units per 1,000 pounds pulling out. So yeah, sure, if we're knocking out 3,000, 4,000 pound crops, we're moving, 45, 50, 60 pounds, 60 units of phosphorus from the system. Generally though, we have a lot of phosphorus in California soil, so that's where the test comes into place. But if we do find that we're starting to see our soil amounts drop and our leaf tissue begin to drop, we could consider an application, and that should be just to hit the removal rates. I generally haven't seen it on west side soils. I have seen it on east side sandy soils, where we have to make applications to match removal rates. And so they're putting out 40 to 50 pounds, not much. You don't need to put out hundreds of pounds of this stuff. And again, with the row crop tradition of the ground out here, there's probably a huge bank available. And I would add that we have never seen phosphorus deficiency in California in trees, dating all the way back to Raleigh Meyer's time, and we have yet to see a yield response from adding phosphorus. But at the same time, I wonder if you just wait till you see a deficiency, how long it takes you to rebuild that bank. So I think rely on that tissue in the soil test. That should give you an indication if you need to apply.
If you're getting root flush now, can we get response from the phosphorus now, or you better wait till the spring so it doesn't have a chance to tie up?
I'm glad you brought that up. We don't get a root flush now.
Oh, we don't?
No.
We
So,
don't tell them to get root flush.
yeah. So we should have put this up in the horticulture aspect. So traditionally we have believed there's a spring root flush and a fall root flush. Complete bullshit. We don't know where they pulled this data from. We don't. We've been trying to work on it. We have a root physiologist who's evaluating this now, and she's like, I think they made this stuff up. and it's in the almond production manual too, the spring and fall, so I get it why people say it. But Astrid Boulder is doing some great work up at UC Davis, Dr. Boulder, and so what she's done is she puts these rhizotrons, these polyacrylamide tubes into the ground, and they take pictures of the root development. And she maps the rate of fine feeder root development through the season. This is what's interesting. Peak fine feeder root development is mid to late June. So you have fine feeder root development all throughout the entire season, but the rate increases as the soil temperatures increase through the summer, and it kind of peaks around mid to late June and then begins to drop. And I thought that was interesting, but also the fact that we still develop fine feeder roots through the spring or through the winter. So if you put a potted tree in the ground in November, it will develop fine feeder roots through November and December and January. So that rate there is a rate going on all year, but the rate peaks and then begins to drop. Now what that means is, so we have a curve like this of development, this means our total fine feeder roots continue to kind of go up through the season. And you have to remember, these things turn over really rapidly. So they may live for 2 to 3 days and then they'll die, or they'll form another root, and more roots form. So you have this peak, and so it matches, and then the total amount probably is the greatest in the fall, and then you get a winter die-off, and then the whole redevelopment begins to occur. But roots only grow where you have a good balance of water, oxygen, soil, and nutrients. So yes, I mean, if you're looking to put put something that tends to bind up, and this includes potassium as well as phosphorus, into the root system, it's good to put it into the water or into the wetting pattern, so it gets closest to the roots where most of the root mass relatively is. So it kind of answered your question, but the timing, I think now, I would say whenever you want to put it out, probably it's whenever you want to do. A lot of people like putting out both potassium and phosphorus in the fall because you get a little bit of help from the wind and try to push it into the ground. But again, these trees only drink what's in that soil solution, what's in the soil water. And so you're right, if the phosphorus is bound up to the soil, you won't free it up until the mycorrhizae do it. And that's just part of the nature of it. So yeah, maybe running some soluble run phosphorus. I'd probably put it on in season where you're getting more rapid uptake. Might be a little bit more beneficial. And that leads me to potassium, because we didn't talk about that. A lot of people tend to use potassium now, and on these types of soils, sure. You can put out some dormant like potassium. I'm going to say the bad word, KCl, potassium chloride. But if you have a good water source, you can be looking at potassium chloride to save a little bit of money. But most people use potassium sulfate, and we applied around 92 units or 92 pounds of K2O for every 1,000 kernel pounds. Almonds are potassium hogs. 3,000 pound crop, you need to put almost out 280 pounds of 280 units of potassium. It's almost 560 pounds of potassium sulfate. So they pull this material out of the ground, and so we can go deficient pretty quickly. But again, keep an eye on your soil, keep an eye on your tissue, and that gives you an idea if you need to address it. Some people go every other year, they slug it on. Some people go every year. Some people go half in dormant, half in season. On the soil types out here, you can do whatever you want. Just keep the tree sufficient with potassium. You don't know you're deficient until it's too late, and by that point you've lost crop. Potassium affects return bloom and spur vitality, so it takes you a while to regenerate the spurs that you lose. It's easy to explain potassium on the west side, it is on the east side. It's soil dependent over there. If you're on really sandy soils, we can talk afterwards. Because you'll want to change your strategy a little bit. Okay, so boron. Boron gets a little tricky over here though. So if you're on the east side, I'd say put out 15 pounds of solid boron to the ground every year. Just put it into the books, put it into the budget. That way you don't have to worry about it. Because I hate to see boron deficiency. It's the quickest way to lose crop. Out here, not really the case, because you have this wonderful additive boron in a lot of the well water. It's a great thing until it becomes toxic. And that's the flip end of it. So a lot of times we're fertilizing our ground with our well water that contains boron. So test your water sample to make sure how much boron's there. If you don't have any boron in your water, in your hull analysis they're suggesting you need, you might be able to get away with an application of 10 pounds or 20 pounds of soy board made to the ground or something similar. Doesn't matter if you use boric acid or soy board. But we're looking for 2 to 4 pounds of actual boron applied to the ground. The higher the shot, the less frequent you'll probably need to make it. Now, we've also found that foliar analysis or foliar applications of boron, even if you make the ground application, are beneficial. And you can make that from pink bud post-harvest to pink bud. Here, we're cutting that rate by 10. We're going 0.2 to 0.4 pounds of boron, actual boron, in a 100-gallon run. So if you're spraying more than 100 gallons, so you're doing, let's say, a delayed dormant, you're putting out 300 gallons of water because you want to make sure you coat those trees to kill everything that's there. Just throwing out an example, you think I'm not supposed to spray 300 gallons at dormant. You need to triple that rate. It's about the concentration of boron in that water. So 0.2 to 0.4 pounds of actual boron for every 100 gallons that's in the water. You cut it, you go to 80 gallons, you got to cut the rate of boron. So keep that in mind, it's about the concentration of it in the water. Too high, it doesn't go in. Too low, you don't get enough in.
So it sounds like you're recommending it even when you have high soil boron.
That's correct. So I was just about ready to get to that point. So how do you know what to do? Your hull analysis. And if you didn't pull a hull analysis, go back out to that orchard and try to get it now. Try to pick up any hulls that you find, send them in. You only need the bottom of a brown paper sack and get an analysis done. If our sufficiency level is 80, if you're below 80, you're deficient. That means you need a soil application and a foliar application. If you're usually in the 90 to 100 range, you probably don't need to make a soil application. You'll get by another year. But you still want to make a foliar application. In fact, you'll make a foliar application all the way up to about 150 ppm in that hull. So you have to have a lot of boron in that tree before you can get away from making a foliar application. So again, Roger Duncan says it best, the advisor in Stanislaw, for the price of a hamburger and french fries, you can increase your yield by 200 to 300 pounds an acre. And that's really what we can do with an application of boron between post-harvest and pink bud. If you're going through now and you want to put a little zinc out, sure, go for it. But I wouldn't do much more tank mixing than boron and zinc. Mainly because if you keep increasing the number of cations that are in that tank mix, it decreases the ability to be pulled into the tree. So keep that in mind as the target approach is a little bit better. The more you put in there, the more competition you create for getting those nutrients into the tree. And with that,
do the benefits come from the increased size or increased number of fruit?
Oh, for boron, it's the increased number. Yeah, so boron helps with, if if you think of that flower, what happens is the pollen tube grows towards a concentration of boron. And so that boron actually moves into the ovary and helps direct pollen tube growth. So when that germ tube makes it, it helps direct it so it gets there faster. And we can spend hours talking about flower botany. Almond is actually really unique that the ovary actually isn't receptive at the time of pollination. So you need this pollen to make it to the ovary within 2 to 3 days because it triggers the ripening or triggers the receptivity of it once that pollination event occurs. So that's why pollination and fertilization are actually separate in almond. Pollen begins, it triggers and makes the ovule receptive, and then the fertilization will happen 2 to 3 days later. So if that takes too long, if that's disjointed from either heat or some other aspect, you'll have poor set. And so that's why boron helps with that process. Just helps. It's like the control tower if we're bringing home the planes onto the runway. Any other questions? That was a lot, huh?
I have a question back on pruning on the first year tree. Should you not prune, but do a head prune even on the first year tree?
It's what you want. So remember, if you make that dormant cut, you're going to get a rapid growth. So this is what I'm trying to encourage. Like, look around. There's a lot of different ways of pruning these trees. And anytime you see a real rapid expansion, that was probably a dormant heading cut. I don't like it. I don't know if I'd cut much off. It's okay to probably cut a little bit off if you want to even up the orchard, but as long as you give it a place to put the energy. If you make a real hard cut, it has to take all that energy and it puts it into the tree, and it has to go somewhere, and so it makes this real rapid growth. So I would say use with caution is probably the appropriate way of looking at it. You know, you guys are all going to laugh at this, but if in an orchard I'd be growing, I don't know if I'd make too many heading cuts on first leaf trees. I'd probably space the scaffolds out as much as I could, and only make a heading cut if the limb is not what I want it to be, and there was a place that I could cut down to. So I'd be making essentially a type of thinning cut when I made that heading cut. I wouldn't leave a stub, I'd cut it down to the next limbs that are forking out.
Where are you going?
No.